Today on Living History, we're speaking with Dr. Henry Huiyao Wang.
At the beginning of 1993, I started to come back. It's time to start my own company. I remember it took me half a year to register a foreign representative office in Beijing. And then I remember also it's very expensive to install a telephone. I mean, your fixed line costs you 5,000 RMB at that time. A fax machine, you need the Ministry of Post and Telecommunication approval. And also I bought in a computer. That computer has been left in the customer for several months. So it's really quite challenging to establish business in China in 1993.
Today, we're speaking with Dr. Henry Huiyao Wang, the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, a top think tank in Beijing. Dr. Wang is a leading expert on topics such as China and globalization, global trade and investment, and international relations with a focus on US-China relationship and global migration. And that's something he got early experience when, after pursuing his bachelor's degree in Guangdong in 1982, he moved first to Canada and England for his MBA and PhD studies, before becoming a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. Back in China, he taught at Peking University and at Tsinghua University, and he was a counselor to the State Council of China, China's cabinet. We're very pleased to speak with him today. Dr. Henry Huiyao Wang, welcome.
Thank you. Very pleased to talk to you.
So I just learned something that I didn't know before. You started learning English reading books in a little shed with a bare light bulb in Sichuan. And there you learned that there was a world outside of China. So how did you imagine that world to be before you got to travel abroad?
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I was a student, we were thirsty for knowledge. I mean, there's a saying in the Chinese: you have to read 10,000 books and travel 10,000 miles. And so we at that time, if you only read the books, for example, you learn English, but also you read the stories of all those famous people in China and outside world. You still feel you are not in touch with them. You really have to see the world. And that's where I think from very early on, my father actually went to foreign countries. He worked in Africa on Tanzania-Zambia Railway, and also my mom's family is very strong in terms of supporting the education. I remember my mom bought me a very expensive at that time Chinese English dictionary when I was at elementary school. So it was really great to see the world, not only from the books, but really you go out. So I think the family education, also reading the books, had sowed the seeds in my mind that someday we have to go to see the world, and that's why that affected my life. And I've been traveled to almost 100 countries and then many regions, and I spent over a decade time outside China, which is a really enormous opportunity for me, and opened the door for me to see the world, and also to bring the world closer to China and China closer to the world. And that's become part of my mission, and that's why I was, founded a think tank, the Center for China and Globalization.
And all that would have been impossible had Deng Xiaoping not reinstated the Gaokao.
Yeah, that's a very important part of my life. Is of course without Deng Xiaoping, we don't know. That's really
take me back to that day. Describe to me how it started.
Yeah,
I believe it was something you heard it on the radio.
Yeah, no, absolutely. After the high school, I only finished the second year of high school, and then we were sent down to the countryside when I was only 17, 18, and then into a countryside knows no future, because the slogan at that time is with one red heart, you settle down in the countryside for your life. So we are really become hopeless at that time, because we don't know when will be the end of this life. Because also in the countryside, we are working very hard, and I have to work from 6 o'clock in the morning when production brigade, the leader actually calls you to go out to the field, and then you work until 11 before the sun getting too hot. And then you come back, you cook your own lunch, which normally is porridge and all this very simple food. And then continue at 3 o'clock until the 10 o'clock in the evenings, because that's where less heated in the day, and enormous hardship. And then after toiling in the fields for the whole day, we make about 20 cents a day, RMB, in the mid-70s. And it's only 70% of a normal farmers can get. They get 25 cents a day. I get 20 cents a day. So that's a very hard life, but I never give up. I mean, that's something very important, is I never give up, and continues to study. But it's very, very difficult life. I mean, in the countryside, you have, first of all, you have always go hungry because there's not enough food to eat, of course. And then when you study, they only give you, a quarter kilo of lamp oil that you can use your lights. So if you read, you cannot get the lights very larger. You have to do it very small, small dim light, and that's how you keep our studies. So I never give up. I listened to the radio. I mean, that was already after Nixon visited China, so they actually resumed English teaching on the radio. And then I read the books I bought from cities, and so I keep with my radio, and also I subscribe to a newspaper where I have to walk about 2 or 3 miles every day to pick it up to read it. And then that's really got me into this studying habit. Because I believe, I said, from the whole world, the trend is that to shrink the rural population to be urbanized. I think why China is doing the opposite, making people from urban cities go to the countryside. It should be the other way around. So I had a belief that this will not be the trend, and I think someday it will be changed. And actually, that day actually did come. I mean, 1977, October. At that time, we have no television and everything. The only way the communication is there's a loudspeaker in your little farmhouse. I live in a very shabby, old and very cold, small cottage house in the farm, and then the loudspeaker actually announced the news that China is going to restore the university entrance exam in December. Well, they made an announcement in October, so they said going to restore the entrance exam in December, and that was really a big surprise to me. And then yet I'm also very happy about it, because I know I'm all the studies I'm keeping practice probably will be useful. Initially, I wanted to be a science student, engineering student, but I found my mathematics are all gone because too long hasn't touched. So I turned into a more social science student. I brushed up my Chinese language, Chinese history, culture, and of course English too. And I applied the English exam and studied. So that was the first year. I think 5.6 million Chinese students, which is accumulated during a decade-long Cultural Revolution, that has no chance to go to university, where university all shut down during those 10 years. So 5.6 million of them that eligible to take the exam, they only recruited about 200,000. So it's about 4% or something. Very low percentage people get into the university, and I'm one of them. It's a class of 77. So we actually got into the university by 1978 in the spring, because the exam happened in December, and then we got notice in February, and then we got into the school in March. But that was totally changing your life. I mean, without that experience, there would be no rest of my stories, of course. And then that is because Deng Xiaoping, who did that. Actually, there's a story about Deng Xiaoping who did that, because he came to be a vice premier in 1977. He hasn't become a top leader yet. And then the first 2 things he was doing is that one is to restore the university exam. And then there was somebody against him at that time, said, Mao said, this is what Mao has decided, you cannot change that. And Deng Xiaoping said, why not? And then they said, okay, because time is too short. We already passed the season of the spring to send out notice, so they were going to miss this year. And Deng Xiaoping said, no, We'll still do it, even it's in December or the end of the year. We still have to do it in 1977. We cannot postpone this any longer. And then people said, okay, there's no printing so many examination papers. There's no paper. And then said, let's use the paper to print the Chairman Mao's works, to print examination papers. So he was very visionary and very decisive. So I think he saved one generation or even two generations of China. And I think he paved the way for China opening and reform, because you can see, that has happened 1977, almost 45, 46 years ago already, 47 years ago. That has really, a whole generation has been trained continuously since then. And then that has actually changed China today. So that's the first decision he's made. The second decision he made was to allow Chinese students to go abroad, because it wasn't really allowed during the Cultural Revolution. And then somebody even told him, said, look, if you send people overseas, people may not be coming back. But then he said, don't worry, let's send them not just a few hundred, let's send them in thousands of, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands. Let's send it. Even a lot of them would not come back. We're still going to have some benefit of those coming back. So he's very bold in his visionary. So I think that attributes to his 5 years in France. I went to the factory he worked in France, actually, very impressive. So Deng Xiaoping has spent 5 years actually outside China. He was studying, and he was working. So he has that vision. He's a designer of China reform and opening up. And that really changed generations and generations. And then so since then, China has expanded into a few hundred universities to 3,000 universities surrounding China. Chinese college students from my year getting into the university, about less than 250,000, now become 12 million a year. So you can see how many times exploded since then. So I think exactly, Deng Xiaoping is so visionary, so decisive, and so reform-minded to push China, even during the 1977, just 1 year after Mao passed away. And that he was very liberated in mind, and he has really changed China completely.
We've spoken with some international students who came to China to study around the same time. I wonder, how did you experience the foreign students? How did you think they adjusted?
Yeah.
It must have also been completely new for you as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that during the early 80s or even late 70s, I mean, China is still just getting out of a cultural revolution. I mean, people living a very basic, simple life, and things are not modern. I mean, at that time, I remember, it took me 3 days actually to travel from Chengdu, where my hometown, to Guangzhou. I have to change the train at Zhengzhou, and it's a very long journey. And also, of course, at that time, China, there's no skyscrapers. I remember the highest building in Guangzhou at that time was one of the hotel was only 20-some stories. It was already the highest building in this whole city. And then there's no taxi, you can only take buses, and there's no subway, and there's no supermarket. So the modern life is basically that we're enjoying today was totally missing at that time. And of course, the things that when we went to the university, there's a very competition among, of course, all the brightest people they recruited during the first 2 years. And I think if at that time there's not many foreigners was able to come in. I mean, very few foreign students. I mean, there are some, but very few. So I think the challenge is that you have to change from the Cultural Revolution to the new reform thinking, and then at that time, liberate your mind, liberalize your thought. It was the movement at that time, and also talk about the philosophy, the meaning of life, and was really, we witnessed the changing of China, because in 1979 they started the special economic zone in Shenzhen. So we were actually in Shenzhen to look at that. It was a village at that time, and later become a whole construction site. And then the Shenzhen International Trade Center was built 3 days in one floor. That's called the Shenzhen Speed. And then that was really very interesting. So a lot of changes, of course, a lot of difficulties, a lot of changes, and a lot of hope, I would describe at that time. So, but we know that China has embarked on opening up and reform, and then so a lot of people has been liberated from the Cultural Revolution. A lot of people has been corrected of the so-called different crimes on them, and so there was a quite open society at that time. So I think that helped China to take off, and then the foreign investment starting to come in. Special economic zone was established, and then 14 coastal cities, and later down to Pudong to whole China. So I think that era was very memorable. I mean, it was really a great changes has taken place, and then we were the generation actually witnessed all those happening during those time.
I noticed the first sentence in one of your recent books, and it said, "Everything is changing all the time. This is an unavoidable conclusion for anyone who observes the world around them for any length of time." And after Guangzhou, you got to go abroad and compare what you had imagined from books and understood from books the world to be to what it was actually like. Tell me what that was like for you, what your initial impressions were those first days.
Yeah, no, actually, after Guangzhou, I was assigned to work in the ministry in Beijing, Ministry of Economic Relations and Foreign Trade for 2.5 years, actually, before I applied to study overseas. I mentioned that there's a professor I met from NYU, and he told me there's an MBA major in North America and internationally that can really very useful. You can learn management, marketing, accounting, human resources. It's a very multidiscipline major. So I was really intrigued into that, and I applied some scholarship with some support. So I ended up in going to Canada in my first destination. And then the impression I got to go to Canada, as I remember, I have to travel from Beijing to Shanghai, Shanghai to Tokyo, Tokyo to San Francisco, and then to New York, and then to Toronto. So it was really 4 or 5 stops on my way in 1984, actually. So after 2.5 years working in the ministry. It was an absolute culture shock. Of course, you see the traffic is big. You see flying over New York. You see the ocean of lights, and then of course you were on a highway, and then the car was just like bicycles in China. There were so many of them, and the high speed, and all those never saw before, of course. And then you got a supermarket with abundant supply and the food. All those at that time was not in China. So that was really big culture shock in terms of affluent society, how that can be, and also what gap that between China and the outside world, particularly in the Western world, there's still a lot of rooms to improve. So I think the cultural shock is one thing, but also you have you found in Western society, you have to be more dependent on yourself. You have to open your bank account. You have to see the doctor by yourself. You have to go to shops. You have to. There's no family, parents to rely, and you are also not have many social network support. But fortunately, I think when we get into the university, we had a very good faculty members, and there's also different student body clubs, which are very friendly to help. And also the students from different countries are all very friendly. So that was really surprised to see. It seems to be there's a lot of volunteers, there's a lot of wants to help, and I'm quite impressed with that. And we also went to church. We also listened to different speakers and attend many social events. Those are really good experience. And of course, I think the only thing we are not really used to is that it takes so long to get a letter from China. You're going to travel probably 20 to 25 days. So you have to write a letter today, and then you get another reply next month. So if you want to get 2 replies, you have to write 2 letters in a month, so that you can get get one in between, with 2 weeks, and then of course making a phone call costs you dozens of US dollars, which was an astronomical number at that time for a poor student. So, I mean, there's many things we have to cope with, but in general, I mean, I'm coping fine. As I mentioned, I used to also stay in an apartment under a bridge, which is very noisy, and but I felt it was a good experience to experience local life, and so the student life was very very enriched and very changed my life, and also gave me a full exposure of what local thinking and what are the minds of the different students from different countries. It was a very good experience. Mm-hmm.
How did you benefit from studying overseas? Specifically, how was going to a Western university at that time different for you?
No, I think one of the things I learned while I was studying in Canada and later at the UK and also at Harvard is that I see a very open style of study. For example, I was in an MBA class, and then we used to be in China, everything's on examination, basically a written examination. There's less chance of talking, there's no classroom participation or debate or presentation. We have to get used to that. There's a lot of exercise like that in the Western universities. I think now China is starting to employ all those techniques, but at that time, in the 80s, coming from Chinese university, basically you were just memorizing, you were taking notes and doing your assignment and examinations, whereas in the Western universities, they give you an assignment, you have to hand in for 24 hours or 48 hours, you have to do a big paper on that. And then your classroom participation, speaking accounts a quarter of your performance results. So all those are fairly new. And of course, the critical thinking, I think I benefit a lot from that. And of course, there's more individualism. You have to be really be encouraged to think loudly and analyze things in different manner. So there's no absolute correctness. You basically have to prove yourself what you said or what you analyze is correct and makes sense and logically sound. And that's really a good exercise I went through. So that I think that has benefited a lot. But also, of course, you go to different countries, you see different culture, different ideology, different thinking, and so you have to, so it makes you see better what you originally come from and what's your, original thought and upbringing and all those things. That makes you a really global mind. I find that study abroad or working abroad can really enrich your global mind. So become more objective, not narrow-minded, not one-sided, and can be very objective when things come to the point. So very, very useful experience. And then that's really, I think, helped us to be a connector or adapter between China and outside world, because we lived overseas, we know what's going on, and then we also lived in China, and so that, there's more and more people like that now. And but in the early 1980s, early time, not many people. I mean, I was one of very few students who went board to study MBA in the early 1980s, and one of the very few Chinese students who actually get into the PhD program at that time. Also studied quite a lot of doctoral studies in the management. So both I'm the first student from China getting into the MBA program, from China getting into the PhD program, and also the first student, actually one of the first students getting into multinational. I worked in a big multinational in Montreal in the late 80s, and then I was the first student from China worked in the Quebec government through the open competition in the early 90s. So all those first that I made it through is demonstrate that those kind of cross-culture communication and the knowledge on both sides can be very useful, and I think I benefit a lot from my overseas study experience.
You previously mentioned that in the 1980s you also worked for the Chinese government. What was that like?
Yeah. No, it was very, very memorable experience when I first joined the Chinese government. I was one of the few also. They picked the brightest, I think, probably in the university. A few. I was two of us actually was assigned to the Ministry of Commerce, and then called the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. And the other one now later on become a Vice Minister of Commerce and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is my schoolmate and classmate. We were assigned to the ministry at the same time. I found that very interesting was that during the first year that I want to get in the ministry, there was so many talents there. Everybody was a college graduates. Everybody knows some foreign language and things like that. So we were actually at the beginning underutilized. People think you are young, you just come, you don't have experience. They are not really giving us a lot of important work to do. But the things can be really opportunity sometimes come. So I remember during the early 1980s, China joined the World Bank. So World Bank sending out experts to come to China, to Beijing, and to really give the World Bank seminars. What's the international competitive bidding, international procurement guidelines, and all those jargons and terms. But I actually already studied them during my spare time because I know those are useful knowledge. And then, so when they do the seminars, because all those are new jargons, new terms, new knowledge, I already studied quite a bit during my evening time when I'm in the ministry. I'm a single and I have lots of time. That day I found is very useful that they finally, because it's a week-long seminar, and then after senior interpreter did that in the first day, so the second day said, okay, you can try. And so when I tried it, because I think that's how the communication can work. You have to know a lot of background knowledge. You have to know a lot of history. You have to know all the technical jargons, the latest terms, where I can all apply that to that interpretation process. And then immediately, the instructor from the World Bank felt there's a chemistry between him and the audience, and then there's a lot of audience asking the right questions since I interpret that. So for the next 5 days, I become the one that did all the interpretation. So that gave me the experience and gave me the confidence that if you really prepare, if you're willing to study the other side, you have enough knowledge. And then if you understand their language and then their culture, you can communicate. So it's really understanding each other is not just understanding language itself, but there's a lot of background knowledge, a lot of technical knowledge, and then so that helps. So what I found in the 80s is that not only with World Bank, we talked to many government visiting officials, which is great, and I think that. There's a lacking of understanding each other. The challenge is really we're not really put each other into others' shoes. We are just talking about its own position, and then so that sometimes it can be difficult. So the good way is really to think from the other side and vice versa, and then that probably helps a lot. And particularly you have to have the people have the knowledge of the other side who has spent times in foreign countries or spend time in China, and particularly knows the language and also the technical background behind. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult communications. So that would be my experience.
You wrote in 1984 to pursue an MBA when few at the time in China even knew what an MBA was.
Yeah.
What an extraordinary decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What did your parents say?
Yeah, no, it was really a big decision for me but that was always what I wanted, because I learned the foreign language, I learned foreign trade and all those things. Also, after 2.5 years working in the ministry, I found I myself need to have upgrade. And at that time, there were opportunities to be assigned to working in the different embassies from China. But I preferred to study, so I applied a few times, and then finally. I took exam, and then I got some scholarship, and then I jumped on the opportunity, because I think also some vision can help, because at that time I know that my parents, my father actually, he worked overseas, and he told me it's important to see overseas. And of course, at that time, China just opened up, and everything you have to learn from overseas. So even though the overseas is really unknown, but it's important that you have to go and experience it. You have to read 10,000 books and travel 10,000 miles, and that's my motto actually. When I study all those historical figures, I mean, whether Deng Xiaoping or Zhou Enlai or the scientists or the social scholars, a lot of them actually made a great contribution to China. They were actually overseas students, and that was really a good example for me actually. So that really encouraged me to go, and so I never hesitated. I was really I applied, and I know I can miss the opportunity at that time working in the ministry, but I think probably it's more important for me to get this more advanced knowledge and advanced preparation for my future works and jobs, and that's where I made that decision. And so it's really a right decision, and then that made me, I would still advise people to go and study. And so my think tank, we have been publishing Chinese students study abroad for the last 15 years, all kind of report, and since 1980s, there's about 10 million Chinese students study abroad, I mean, including probably Hong Kong, Macau, everybody. That's huge, a chunk of talent. Of course, a lot of it stayed overseas, but then the global talent circulation and, of course, the talent return has greatly changed China. So I think this study abroad movement has initiated by Deng Xiaoping has really made huge changes in China, and also benefited millions of people who did that. And of course, I'm one of them.
At this point, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our project. The period between China's opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping and the 2010 Shanghai Expo deserves to be remembered. We want to collect the memories that Chinese, Americans, and other foreigners made together during these times. We hope you will subscribe to our channel to see many more interviews like this one in the coming weeks. If you too have a story that you think needs to be remembered, we would very much like to hear from you. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Shanghai for their generous support. Without their sponsorship, we would not have been able to start this channel.
And then you eventually decided to come back to China and start your own business. And I had heard from other people that it was a very challenging time, but that there was also this atmosphere of optimism. How do you remember these times?
Yeah, no, it was very good. I mean, after my stint in Hong Kong, after my as a chief trade representative for Quebec government for Hong Kong, China at that time, and so when I finished that job, I mean, Deng Xiaoping was actually inspected Shenzhen, his famous 1992 Southern tour. And he said, if you want to make a greater contribution, it's better to come back to the mainland. So that was a great inspiration for me. And I actually, after my duties in Hong Kong, and I didn't return to Quebec because I felt I already in Hong Kong, and I would like to come back to China. So at the beginning of 1993, I started to come back. But what to do? That's the thing. I didn't have a second, a job that I already aimed at. But I think maybe it's time to utilize my experience in business, academic, and the government, and then probably it's time to start my own company, to be an entrepreneur. And then that was really, got me into establishing my company at that time. And then, of course, there's no office tower in China, in Beijing. And then so we rented a hotel, a room where you can sleep and where you can work. But it's really also hard life. For example, because there's a time difference. During the daytime you're busy. During the evening there's a phone coming back from North America, from Europe, from different places, because we're doing international business consulting. And then I remember it took me half a year to register a foreign representative office in Beijing. I get all the approvals, you get all the sponsors, you have to talk to different bureaucratic organizations, and then finally we got that. And then I remember also it's very expensive to install a telephone. I mean, your fixed line costs you 5,000 RMB at that time. And also, you even have a fax machine, you need the Ministry of Post and Telecommunication approval. And also, I bought in a computer when I finished my job in Hong Kong. And then that computer has been left in the customer for several months before I can redeem it out. I can get it out, because you have to, whether it's going to be tax exempted or not, or how a computer is classified as what kind of tariff it should apply. It's all those things. And they never had the good examples, and then we have to wait all the final decision. Finally, I got it then. And so it's really quite challenging to establish business in China in 1993. I remember at that time there's no taxi in China. It's only a very small mini van, and then you pay 10 yuan and you can travel across Beijing completely. Even that is very expensive. So it was really a good experience. But then I think the most important part is really to get business.
China joining the WTO must have helped a lot.
Yeah. No, China joining WTO is a monumental landmark for the Chinese opening up. And it takes a long time. China actually it takes 15, 16 years for China. Initially, it was the GATT. And then later on, they changed it into the WTO, and China still wants to apply that. But I would classify the Chinese movement of joint WTO is actually a mini revolution in China, because you have to abolish so many outdated courses, you have to change the minds of the people, you have to really get people on top of that, and then I would say it was really a big battle actually. People are so get used to the old style. For example, before China joined WTO, the foreign trade was only managed by a few dozen Chinese state-owned companies, monopolized. So everybody have to go through the foreign trade company to do the foreign trade. There's license required, there's a quota required. Was such a big headache and bureaucratic tape to go through. But then, since China joined WTO, and then they liberalized all those areas. And then you can see that, China now actually, and I just read the news, there's about 6 million companies can do foreign trade. Basically everybody, individual, if you want to do it, you're allowed to do it. All the companies. Incredible. And then China become the largest trading nation in the world. And then China GDP since joining WTO has gone up 12 or 13 times already, enormously. And so I think the challenge at that time was really to break through the psychological barrier, because people worry about joining WTO. For example, people talk about joining WTO is like wolf is coming. The wolf is coming. For example, one of the arguments, they said, okay, China's automobile was in the infant stage. If they join the WTO, they will be wiped out by the foreign companies. The foreign automobile will flood China. China will be no more domestic industry of automobile, and that turned out to be not true, because even though there's more foreign company come, of course you got a Volkswagen, you got BMW, the Mercedes, everybody. But before joining the WTO, there's only one model of Chinese foreign company, which is Santana. 20 years, one model, never changed. But since they joined WTO, there's a competition. There's a lot of foreign companies come, and also that's also elevated the Chinese auto industry. And then you can see after 20 years, China joined the WTO, China now become the largest automobile makers in the world. And last year, they become the largest exporter of automobile in the world. So joining WTO has greatly benefited the Chinese company, but also made China to make more contribution to the world. And so I think the WTO has many advantages. They liberate people's mind, make people more open. They also give them more experience in test the water, be more competitive. And thirdly, they actually cultivate a lot of Chinese international companies too. And also further, it was really important that you had all the multinational come to China, but also for Chinese to go to interact with them is important. So there's not much domestic interaction. There's also China needs to improve as well, like the payment system, like the like the travel assistance in China should more convenient, and maybe even open the internet ban. Like you can access Google, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, all those things I think China should do as well. But I'm thinking is the people-to-people exchange is crucial. It's very important to enhance understanding, and it's the bond between the two countries and also the rest of the world. And that's why I was encouraged by President Xi. Actually, he speak at San Francisco summit when he visited the U.S. and he was saying China would be interested to invite 50,000 youth from U.S. to come to China. So which means each year 10,000. I hope that target can be realized, and then more people can come.